If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Amitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
Welcome back, Equity Warriors. Thanks for tuning in to this special episode. My guest today is Brendan Cox. He's the Director of Policing Strategies at the LEAD Support Bureau, advising global jurisdictions on law enforcement assisted diversion initiatives. He retired as Chief of Police from Albany, New York in 2017 after a distinguished 23-year tenure. Under his leadership, the Albany Police Department was honored by the Department of Justice for its progressive policing. Two words you don't hear together too often, progressive and policing. Brendan holds degrees from the University of Dayton and Marist College. He's an adjunct professor at the State University of New York at Delhi and an active member of various law enforcement and community justice organizations. It is my honor to welcome Chief Cox. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dr. Berry. I appreciate you having me on today. It's really an honor to be here.
Well, I have to say, people are probably wondering why I have a cop on the show. So my first question to you is, who are you? What do you do? And why should my listeners care?
Yeah, so, I think it's interesting, I think, that you pose that, I spent 23 years in policing in Albany, and, I learned a lot. And I think, I got into that business because I wanted to be part of my community and I wanted to help people. And that's why the overwhelming majority of police officers get into that line of work. They want to help people out. I learned a lot of things over that time. And I know that, we need to continue to change. We need to continue to evolve. And quite frankly, we need to do better. And that's why I continue to do the work that I do. So, I was lucky enough to rise up to the rank of chief of police. It was something that I never saw myself do, but it happened. I became chief. I ultimately oversaw a group of individuals that were some great people, both sworn and non-sworn people. And I also was able to get to know a community that if I never was able to do the job I did, I would have never been able to get as intimately involved with as diverse a group of people as I did and understand different people's walks of life and understand that not everybody came from the same background that I did and not everybody had the same advantages that I did, and understand that it wasn't their job to change to me. It was my job to change to them and to understand what it is they went through and how it was my job, especially as chief of police, to try to figure out how to do better with the men and women of our department to provide the services that we were supposed to work with the community to help not just provide public safety, because it wasn't our job to provide it, but work together to have public safety, because that's everybody's job. And it was just part of our job to work with the public to ultimately do that and work with all the various people that existed. And that ultimately led me to understand that we needed different approaches and not just put handcuffs on people. Putting handcuffs on people was a temporary stopgap to an incident. And while there were certainly times, and I was part of some major investigations, and there are people that sit behind bars now from investigations I was a part of, that some of those people did need to be removed from the public for a safer public. But the majority of people, that's not true with, and that arresting people is a very small part of what policing is about, and that there's got to be other solutions out there, things like public health solutions. And I was lucky enough to learn from a lot of great people that we needed to look at things like juvenile justice a lot differently. And we needed to look at addiction and mental health and poverty in a different light. And that arresting people, the criminal legal system, was never going to be able to address those issues. So I was lucky enough to get into involvement in things like harm reduction. And my current role now, once I retired, was to become the director of this thing called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, the LEAD Support Bureau. And what LEAD is it allows police to recognize that an arrest of an individual who suffers from a substance use disorder, who has a mental illness, who's living in poverty, and that's why they're coming in contact with the law enforcement, that might not be the best solution. In fact, the best solution is not to arrest them, but rather to get a case manager involved and hand them off to the case manager and let the case manager really figure out a person-centered approach where a harm reduction recognition that the substance might not be the issue, that there might be other deeper issues that a case manager can take the time to work with and really figure out what that person needs and realize that, we have a lot of systems that need a lot of work and that are in fact broken. But if we don't collaborate and work together, we're never going to actually be able to fix those. So I was lucky enough throughout my career and throughout my life to learn from a lot of different people from a lot of different places that, we need a collaborative approach, and that while handcuffs might be appropriate in a small percentage of situations, they're not appropriate in most situations. And while police are part of a solution, they're not the full solution. And if we're not working together, then we're just working against each other. And if we have an us versus them, if you and I aren't able to have a conversation, if we're not able to get here on a podcast and talk, then we're never going to come to a solution. And that's not acceptable. We have to figure out a way forward. We have to figure out a way to be able to, it's public safety is only part of it. This is about humanity. We have to figure out solutions together to move forward. It's part of the greater good. We have to be able to get there.
So you said probably four things, and I'll remember three that are really refreshing and insightful. And so one, you said that basically not all cops are bad cops. And I think like anything else, coming from education, not all teachers are bad teachers. Not all teachers are great teachers either. There are always going to be a few because we are humans and we are flawed naturally, but we have to recognize how much good can come from the good folks and hopefully overweigh some of the bad that makes it into the media that, tends to sort of jade our perceptions about what entire groups of people are like. I mean, it's no different a bias than people may have about someone's skin color or based on their religion. Based on our professions, we've got good folks, we've got bad folks. I do share that, I'm very proud to be the niece of the former deputy chief of police from my hometown. That's one uncle. My stepfather was now retired. Well, he's gone now, but police officer. Again, actually, he was my uncle's training officer. We won't go down that path. Cousins who are cops, another uncle who was a state trooper. So I understand that they are humans, but there are so many people who never come in contact with a police officer except when it's at a moment of crisis. So I think it's important for people to hear what you're saying. When we talked before the show, you shared a story with me about how students and officers did a sort of a reversal of roles in a role play. And so that really sort of resonated with me, and I think it will with the audience as well. So if you would, please share that story.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our strategic goals was called winning over a generation. And it was actually part of what you just spoke about, that, we have police and youth that only come into contact in negative situations. They only come into contact during a crisis. So we realized we needed to really build better relationships among youth and police and have opportunities for that to happen. So we had this initiative called the Youth Police Initiative. It's a national initiative that takes place. And it happened over a period of 5 days where youth came together with some really fantastic moderators, really got to build a foundation of understanding and trust with the moderators to talk through some of the things that they had going on in life. Police got a chance to talk to the moderators, really talk about where they were coming from. And then the youth and police got together and really started to build some relationships and trust and understanding with each other. And one of the exercises that they did, we had at 3:00 in the afternoon every day during the school year, schools let out. And we, like a lot of cities in Albany, there were times when we had problems at school dismissal. There were tough problems sometimes with violence. But there was also times when it was just kids being kids. And I tell a lot of people, when I became a young cop in 1994, I was 23 years old. I was not that far away from the age gap of some of those kids that were walking down the street. And I think for a lot of young officers, trying to figure out the difference between a young person walking down the street being a kid and a young person walking down the street may be engaged in activity that we need to take a step in and actually protect somebody else from or protect that person from. Those are two difficult things to do sometimes. So one of the activities was that the kids got to play the officers and show kind of what they see of the officers when they're on the street. And the officers got to play the kids and what they see of the kids at dismissal time. And for both of them, it was a wake up call. For the kids, they were like, "Oh, that's what you're seeing when you see us on the street." And for the officers, they were like, "Man, that's what we're acting like when we're out there. That's what you see of us." And both of them were like able to, like, as the exercise was done, be like, "This isn't what we want you to see of us." Like, the officers were like, "No, we want you to trust us. We want you to be able to approach us. We want you to be able to come to us if there is an issue, but we also want you to be a kid. Like, we also want to understand that, like, when you're going home, like, we want you to be able to be okay, like, in that corridor. We don't want you to think we're the bad guy." Like, and it was just an interesting piece. It was almost like the highlight of the week for them to see that. And at the end of the week, when we handed out certificates, the officers were there and the kids were there. And to see them, all hugging each other and high-fiving each other, it was a really amazing thing. And, for us, it was a twofold goal. It was not only to build those relationships, but, we're also talking about a time when not a lot of people want to be police officers right now.
Yeah.
And we were also trying to look at, well, what's the future going to look like? We want our youth to be police, but we also want the police department to reflect what the community looks like. And obviously, as we sit here today on camera, I mean, I'm a white guy. I mean, yeah, I grew up in the city, but I mean, there was a lot of times where we would just get, white kids from the suburbs applying to be police officers in a city they didn't grow up in. And not that they didn't, a lot of them didn't become good police officers, but they had to acclimate themselves to a whole new place and not understand what a lot of the kids growing up in an inner city were going through, especially kids that didn't look like them and that they never walked in their shoes. So we also wanted to, like, have kids of color want to be police officers and say, like, I can not only trust the police, but this is something I'd want to do. I mean, this is a great job. Like, it's not only a great job because it has a lot of great benefits to it. Like, there's a lot of places you can go in life based off of being a police officer. There's no shame in being a police officer. We want our community members to want to be in public safety. It's an important role. So, there's a lot of benefits to having that, to breaking down those barriers and having kids, not only get to know police officers, but want to be police officers. And they can also then change not only how the department looks, but also how we respond and what we do and what policing looks like. So we actually respond appropriately to what the issues are in the community.
That is an exact parallel to what we see in education. There is a teacher shortage, right? There are not enough teachers for the classrooms. There are not enough police officers for our communities. The people who are teachers, and I may be off on my number, is roughly 85% of elementary school teachers are white women, but 85% of our students are not white women. So very similar. They may want to do the job and they may become very, very good at the job, but they've not had the lived experiences of the children that they serve. So it's that same dynamic, right? They're good people. They want to do good, but sometimes there's a little difficulty in making that connection with the kids that are in front of them. And it's one of the things that both our professions, I suppose, have to work on. And, typically we see teachers, from the perspective of being a student. And if you ever had a mean teacher, that's the bad part about teachers that you'll remember. Now, we've also all had, I would hope we've all had at least 1 or 2 or 10 or 12 phenomenal teachers. And when that's what we see, it may make us want to become teachers. So I think in both our industries or our professional areas, that there are things that we can do to improve how we're perceived by the other people that we come in contact with. I think it's interesting. And because of that, I think that the way that teachers have to do that work to bridge that gap between their lived experiences and those of their learners is probably about the same as law enforcement officers would have to do. So I'm going to ask you, when you think about bridging that gap between law enforcement and learners of color, learners who are linguistically diverse, culturally diverse, children who live in areas of low wealth or low income, and I don't like to use the word kids of poverty, because I firmly believe that no matter what your financial circumstances are, you have a wealth of knowledge, one, to survive in that system that you've been placed in, as well as cultural experiences that other people cannot imagine or connect to. So I like to call them children of low financial wealth. So how do we bridge that gap? How do you, in your profession, how do you suggest folks bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think number one, the first thing we need to do is not write people off. That's the first thing we need to do. And I think far too many people just write people off and just say, well, they don't have the means to do this. And it's like, what do you mean they don't have the means? First of all, just label folks is just completely wrong. And then second of all, I think we need to take an internal look at what are, go beyond policies and procedures, but look at what our hiring practices are, what we ultimately foul people out of. In the civil service process of policing, when we hire people, there are so many different places where we foul people out, whether it's the civil service test itself, whether it's the interview process, whether it's, we're a paramilitary organization, paramilitary career. So, people, when they're late for an interview, people, if they haven't shown up, if they haven't responded on time, we don't tend to have a lot of empathy for people based on what the living situation might be, and understanding that, like, well, wait a second, what's happening in the home that this person might not be getting a message, might not get a letter that we send them. Like, what do we need to adapt to ultimately recognize that we're not reaching the person, not because they don't have a desire or an ability to do this job, but because there are barriers in place for that individual, and we need to be able to overcome. Because, just because, and I don't, just like you, like, you try to use different terms, but just because I grew up in what I would call a stable household, where, like, when I walked in the house, my mother would be like, you got a letter from the city of Albany, like, you better open this right now and figure out what it is that next step is, because I know this is what you're the job you want on. But, like, that was because, the household I grew up in, my mother stayed home, took care of us, took care of her mother and my father's parents, who both lived in our house while my father was working 2 full-time jobs. And we were able to do that. There's a lot of people, the kids you just talked about, if mom's working 3 jobs, the system, and I don't want to stereotype, but, our system has taken the father out of the house because we've arrested him. He's got a drug conviction. I was talking to somebody else about drug policy yesterday. There's a drug conviction, so we're not now letting the father move back into the house, because God forbid we do that. We'll kick everybody out of the house because somebody with a drug conviction can't live there. So, all of the circumstances that might exist for somebody. And now that kid who's coming home from school might also have to work, isn't getting the mail, the stability's not there. What are we doing to try to foster those relationships and say, what are the barriers in place to ensure we're not failing you out? Or, like, what is it? What is our psychological test really testing? And does it have its own biases? And, like, what are we looking at when it comes to the fact that, we are ultimately getting more white kids from the suburbs that are passing this than young Black men and women from the inner city? Like, why is that happening? So, I mean, we need to continue to look at that. We need to make sure that, we have culturally competent leaders looking at things, and that our human resources offices are paying attention to that, and that we're just not relying on the old civil service ways of doing things, that we're continually looking to do different things. We were able to start an Explorer program. We were able to start a program with our youth employment, our summer youth employment program, where we had teens coming in and getting paid over the summer, getting to meet officers, getting to understand what policing was, trying to not just encourage them to become police officers, but also giving them mentors, getting to know their families better. So, how can you try to set people up for success? We had officers writing youth letters of recommendation for college. How can you help connect kids to community college where, we can go for, a lower cost and actually get that education folks need? How can we look at different things? And then also, like, how can we look at life circumstances and recognize that, not everybody can be like, well, I lived in a circumstance, especially, we look at, when we look at associates and stuff like that, like not if we grew up in some areas, sometimes we're going to have people that, hey, this person might have associated with me. Yeah. Because they lived right next door to me. Like, okay, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, we don't always get to choose where we live. And certainly as children growing up, and particularly it's something I talk about in education as well. The children have to survive in the communities that they live in. And so the idea that you would cut off everyone who might at some point in time have a criminal ding against them is not always practical, which reminds me of a funny instance. I'm one of those people, I'm friendly with everybody. Growing up as a kid, friendly with everybody in the neighborhood, at high school. It didn't matter if you were a straight A student or you couldn't read. I mean, if you were nice to me, I was going to be nice to you. And I had this MG Midget. I don't know if you remember the MG Midget, little teeny tiny car, and it would break. It was a cool car because it was a convertible. Although people the guys would get together and they would move it in the student parking lot. So I'd go back to where my car was supposed to be at the end of the school day and it wasn't there. But it would break down quite frequently. And I was coming home from church, cutting through downtown, which on the weekends was pretty much deserted in the afternoon. There was not another car in sight when something went funk, and I learned later on it was a tie rod that was broken. So my car was not going anywhere. So here I am in my little church clothes and my little red convertible, broken down. And, for those who don't see or listen to me, I am old enough that was at a time when there was no such thing as cell phones. So looking around to see if there was even a payphone around that I could walk to. And I see this group of, 5, 6, 7 older, not old, but young 18 to 25-ish Black men coming towards my car. And I can't even remember what I thought at the moment other than this may not be the best place for me to be right now. I'm a small person. I'm alone. It's deserted and I have zero protection because even if I lock the doors, there's no top on my car, right? But as they got closer, I saw their smiles. And they were guys that I had gone to high school with who had dropped out, disappeared, not sure what all happened to them, but none of it was good. And they walked up to the car and they said, "What are you doing here? This is not a good place for you to be." And so I told them what happened. And they said, "That's all right. We got you." They picked up the car. They put it on the curb. They walked with me to a payphone so I could call for a tow truck. And they waited with me until the truck came and I was safe. Just because we see people through a certain lens does not mean that they are bad people, right? Life circumstances happen. I think about the number of people I went to high school with who are in prison, doing life sentences because of circumstances that maybe would not have happened had our system been a little bit different. Everything from housing situations to employment situations. So, we see it in the classroom, you see it on the streets. And I think that we have to find a way to bridge that gap to learn more about our communities, as well as farming within those communities and creating systems that enable people to achieve the goal or a possibility, an option to go into law enforcement, to go into teaching and not be held back because of the circumstances that they grew up in. Because heaven knows if I was judged for all the people I was acquainted with, I would never have been able to get a teaching credential. And I certainly would not have gotten to where I am in this world today. So something for us to think about. LEAD, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, Let Everyone Advance with Dignity program. Tell us what the core tenets are of that. Hey there, Equity Warriors. I want to take a quick moment to share something exciting with you. You know how passionate I am about equity in education, right? Well, I've created a special space, a safe space, where we can dive even deeper into these crucial topics. It's our Patreon channel, and I'd love for you to join me there. Here's why it's so awesome. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll get access to exclusive content that I will not share anywhere else. I'm talking additional insights, workshops like you would get in regular professional learning sessions, resources that can really amplify your impact in education. But it's more than just extra content. By subscribing, you are directly supporting our mission. You're helping to create more valuable discussions and resources that you've come to love. You're part of the change we're making in educational systems. And let me tell you, our Patreon community, it is something special. It's a place where passionate educators and advocates can come together, share ideas, and drive real change. So if you're ready to take your commitment to educational equity to the next level, I'd be thrilled to have you join me. Just head over to patreon.com/3E podcast. That's patreon.com/3E podcast. Remember, your support means the world to me, and it helps me continue this important work. Together, we can create the educational system all our students deserve. Thanks for considering, and now let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, I think, the first thing to know is that, LEAD started with this recognition that, first of all, we had these large racial disparities in how drug enforcement was done. In Seattle in the mid-2000s, there was an open-air drug market in the Belltown neighborhood of Seattle. Open-air drug markets like a lot of our cities had. Certainly, we had them in Albany. And the police at the time were...
Can you explain to my listeners what an open-air drug market is? Because that's new for me. So I'm going to assume that I'm not the only person who doesn't know what that is.
Yeah, an open-air drug market is really, drugs are used by everybody. There's no race, ethnicity, economic market of people that don't use drugs. And there's really no place you can't get drugs. But for an open-air drug market is really a place that you can go and where there are people selling drugs really openly, usually on the street corner, where it's pretty clear that, when you go down the street, there's the person selling, you approach, and that's going to be the person you either buy from, or they're going to go and either point you in the right direction of where to go or get somebody who's going to come over to you and sell.
So I think in some communities, we refer to them as corner boys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Perfectly put. That's where you're going to go and find the corner boy. Absolutely.
Okay.
And in most of our jurisdictions, and especially in the 90s and 2000s, the way police handled those was, we made a lot of arrests, and that's what Seattle was doing. They were arresting a lot of people, but they weren't seeing any results, just like no one was seeing results anywhere. We can arrest people for selling and using drugs all we want, but that doesn't mean that we're going to, number one, rehabilitate people for using substances or deter other people for using substances. And the numbers have played out. We incarcerated people. We increased incarceration for nonviolent drug offenses by 700%, but the increase in drug use continued to go up. So incarceration did not work. But on top of that, not only was the revolving door of the system and people not getting better, there was also the fact that there were large racial disparities. And racial disparities, we see those no matter what community you're in. In Seattle, it happened to be that the city is about 6% African American, but about 65% of the folks being arrested were African American. So, very large, easy to see racial disparities. So not only were the police and prosecutor and community frustrated by the fact that people were getting arrested and not getting any better, but also there were folks from the civil rights world that were frustrated because of those racial disparities. So there were several lawsuits filed and other actions taken in court about the patterns and practices of policing, and people wound up at a mediation table. And basically the civil rights world and the policing and prosecution world kind of came to an agreement that the status quo was not appropriate for either the reasons of racial disparity or the fact that there were people with unmet behavioral health issues that were not getting any better. So they kind of said, well, let's do something different. Let's give actually police officers a different option other than arrest people for low-level drug offenses, for those unmet behavioral health issues. So LEAD was established to really give police the opportunity at the point of arrest when somebody allegedly commits a crime based on an addiction, based on a mental health issue, based on poverty, based on homelessness, that if those are the driven issues, that an officer can say, hey, instead of me arresting you, let me offer you help. And that help is in the form of a case manager. And the case manager can come to the scene. I can do a warm handoff. And that case manager can start working with that person right away. And it can be done in a philosophy of harm reduction. So a recognition that not everybody is ready, willing, or able to make big change. That abstinence might not be what that person's seeking at that moment, but that if we can make incremental change and it can be person-centered and that person really identifies what it is they're ready to do, and that case manager can work with them in that arena and really recognize that they need to build a relationship and build trust and really reduce stigma, that they can start to really make really good change. And what they showed in Seattle was a 58% reduction in recidivism for folks that came into LEAD compared to people that got arrested as usual. They showed a better access to services. They showed a reduction in cost for folks coming into LEAD as opposed to them going through the system. And they showed an increased positive relationship for the participants in LEAD, for the officers that were referring them. And as LEAD evolved, LEAD went from not only a chance for an arrest diversion, so when somebody's alleged to have committed a crime, but also a proactive referral where officers don't have to wait until somebody's committed a crime, but they can proactively refer somebody in. Officers know individuals in the community that have, had contact with them that have those unmet behavioral health needs, so they don't have to wait till somebody commits a crime. They can make a proactive referral. And then the let everyone advance with dignity really came after George Floyd was murdered. So when that happened, we have a lot of work with civil rights folks, a lot of work with community folks. And LEAD has always been, the gatekeeper of LEAD has always been police. And folks have always asked, including those of us that have been intimately involved in LEAD, what if we didn't always have police be the gatekeeper? What if we gave another option? So let everyone advance with dignity really came about as a way to have community members be able to make a direct referral into LEAD. So if I own that corner store, and I've owned that corner store for 20 years, and I know the community, I'm part of the community, and I've got somebody who comes into the store and they have problematic behavior, maybe they're stealing from me, but I know that they've got a problem and I know they just need help. And I don't want to call the police. I don't want them arrested. I can instead give the folks at LEAD a call and say, hey, I've got Brendan. He comes in, he steals from me. I know he's got some issues going on. I don't want to bother the police. Can you guys do some outreach to him and see if you can get him some help? And our case managers usually work for a community-based agency. So they're not working for the police. They're working for a community-based agency. So the case managers can do some outreach, come see me, offer me help. I wind up becoming a LEAD participant. With LEAD, there is a lot of collaboration, not only at a higher policy level, but also at an operational level. So case managers are ultimately speaking with police and prosecutors and public defenders, and the participants sign a release of information so they know this. But they're doing that to not only let everybody know what's happening with participants, but our participants are usually pretty engaged or have been engaged with the criminal legal system for a long time. So a lot of folks have been arrested numerous times. So we want to make sure we're removing barriers for folks. So if I'm in LEAD and I've been arrested 30 times, I might have some old cases that are still sitting with the prosecutor. So rather than have the prosecutor continue to move cases forward while a case manager is trying to work with me, knowing that there's no miracles that are going to happen, it's going to take some time to work with me. The way, I mentioned before, systems are broken. No one can get into housing overnight. No one can get, even if I'm ready for treatment, nobody can get into treatment overnight. Folks need, even if a lot of the folks we work with aren't usually even ready for housing or treatment. So case managers are usually working with them on getting ID, getting a birth certificate, just really trying to figure out what's going on in that person's life. Sometimes folks just need, respite need a break, need food. Folks need to really somebody to establish a relationship before they're ready to tell their life story and really go sit down and get an assessment. So we want to try to make sure that the prosecutor is not putting somebody in jail for 30 days while the case manager is working with them, especially if that person winds up saying like, hey, I am ready for treatment. And all of a sudden the treatment slot opens up. If they're in jail, that's not going to help anybody out. So there's a lot of coordination on the back end. So it's really a holistic approach to recognizing that, we got to work with people, meet them where they're at, and have more of a holistic approach with the individual and really recognize, how people change and how we can meet them where they are to try to affect that change.
So it sounds to me like a big part of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, a big part of this is civil rights, right? And recognizing, working with community organizations. There's a part of me that's thinking also, and again, inform me, correct me, help me, that this sounds like you're doing some of what community groups were calling for when they asked to defund the police, which was not to take all the money away from them, but to find other avenues for help and treatment and supporting communities as opposed to just locking everybody up. Am I kind of right? Not right?
No, I think you're right. I think one of the things that we recognized a long time ago is that we have asked the police and the criminal legal system to deal with issues that they shouldn't deal with. And I think if you talk to, back to, when we first started this conversation, I think if you talk to a lot of police, if you talk to a lot of prosecutors, they will say that there's things they've been asked to deal with that they shouldn't deal with. And we're trying to say, hey, let's remove this person from the criminal legal system and get them into a long-term system of care. And let's utilize that case manager and this harm reduction philosophy to do that. And let's recognize that right now, the police are the folks that are coming into contact with folks, and that folks are. And let's also recognize that there are folks that are ultimately involved in problematic behavior in the community, and we do need a response to that. But that response shouldn't be handcuffs. So let's give officers a different option to utilize in doing this.
Gotcha.
And realize
it's like
that,
if you're a teacher and the only thing you can do with the student who's acting out, maybe acting out because something happened at home, maybe acting out because they've been picked on, bullied on the playground. But if the only thing you can do is to suspend them, then that's the only avenue you take. Whereas, there are many other things that could be done in support of that child to help them as opposed to criminalize them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you have a background in criminal justice and public administration.
Yes.
Right. So understanding the policy aspect as well as what happens on the ground, on the streets in the neighborhood. How do you balance or what do you think the balance should be, or the relationship even, between policymakers and the folks, the boots on the ground, so to speak?
So, it's an interesting relationship and it's an interesting balance. I think one of the things that we need to work on is that we need to make sure that policymakers and the boots on the ground are in the same room, have the same language, and understand each other. And it's awful helpful if the policymakers have actually walked on the ground in some form or manner. I think it's really difficult. And I mean, sometimes I get asked to weigh in on policies on things that I haven't walked that ground on. And I find it difficult to be like, okay, I'm going to weigh in on a policy in an area that, yeah, I feel like I can weigh in on. I feel like I can talk about, but I haven't really understood what was happening at that moment or with these folks that are doing this work. So I think it's really important that we have folks in the room that both understand policy and how policy gets drafted and made and put in place, but also the folks that have to execute that policy and ultimately carry it all out. And if we're not getting the boots on the ground folks, and if we're not getting real people involved in helping inform that policy, we're gonna fail. Like, we're not gonna be able to do it. So like one of the things like I used to try to do in the police department is when we were going to change a policy, especially if we were going to do something completely and new and different, is to take, especially, by the time I was chief, I'd been in the command staff, I think, for 12 years. So I hadn't, I certainly was always out and about in the community. I was out in the street, but I wasn't answering calls for service. I wasn't, the things I was doing weren't frontline police work. Those were two different things of what I was doing compared with what an officer was doing when they went out on patrol and started answering calls, or what a detective was doing in investigating a call. So I think it's important to be able to get people in a room and say, okay, this is what we're looking to do. This is what we're looking to implement. This is how we want to do it. This is why we want to do it. Now I want you and your input to help build this. I want your feedback on how this policy is going to affect your job. I want you to get feedback from your peers on what this looks like. I think we need to be able to do that. And then I think we also need to be flexible enough that policy can't stay stagnant, that we can't put policies in place and think that they just live forever, that we have to be able to make adjustments with policies. And that doesn't mean we need to wait a year. That certainly doesn't mean that we need to wait 5 years. But if 60 days into something's wrong or something's not working right, make an adjustment. Don't make your policies so difficult that we can't make some simple adjustment. But there are so many policies that are negatively affecting people or that just don't make any sense, that harm our communities, and that people don't listen to people on the ground. The simple, the issues we have right now with people that need access to substance use treatment, that people need access to medical assisted treatment. The fact that somebody who needs to get methadone still has to go to a methadone clinic to get their medication 6 days a week. That's absurd. We didn't learn anything from the pandemic when there were some pilots that actually allowed people to take their methadone home. No, we should be allowing people to do that. But that's a policy issue. Like, why haven't we listened to the people on the ground? And why haven't we made those changes? Because people that are making those decisions aren't the people that are living this on the ground. We have to be able to work with the folks that are living this on the ground.
Yeah. Bureaucracies are interesting animals, I'll say. Not any different with the way you're explaining and then what's experienced in any school system, especially a large school system, is that the people making policy are not connected to what happens every single day in the classroom or on the playground. So I want to take it down to kids. A lot of what you've been sharing, I think, is going to be really helpful for my listeners, as adults. They have family members, but I also know that a lot of folks are tuning in because we're, very focused on education and children, juveniles, and what happens to them. Has anything from LEAD or these organizations trickled into the school systems anywhere?
So there's been one example of LEAD in the schools. So we have, as a main rule, we have focused on adults for a number of reasons. The main two reasons why we have focused on adults is, one, this harm reduction approach of working with an individual and having a person-centered approach. It lends itself to really focusing on that individual, and working with youth, as you know, really would entail not just working with that youth, but working with that family and really, really, really diving in and making sure that there were supports, not just for the youth, but for the rest of their family, as there should be if we're going to do this right. And LEAD is an intense initiative. So our case managers work very intensely and have a very small caseload with our LEAD participants. So if we were to build this for youth, it would take an enormous amount of case managers to do it with youth. So we have stayed out of that arena for that. That's been one reason. The second reason is, being a pure harm reduction approach, we have also very stuck with a core element of being non-abstinence based. So if someone comes in and says, I am going to stay using drugs, I'm not going to stop using drugs, then our case managers they don't say to them, you have to stop using drugs. That's dangerous. You're going to hurt yourself. That doesn't come into the conversation. They will talk to them about how to more safely use, because there's safer ways to use drugs, and how to keep them alive until if they are ready to stop using. But we have participants that never stop using drugs. That's a reality of life. There are people that don't stop using drugs. If we were to start working with youth, we know that has its own complications. And we certainly recognize there's a difference between a 13-year-old and a 25-year-old when we're working with those two individuals. So we have stayed focused on adults for those two main reasons. There has been one program that did do a youth lead initiative, and that was in Houston. And that was in the school district. It was in mainly 2 middle schools. And it was not focused on substance use, but it was very much focused on behavior that was happening in school that was being responded to in a way where the Houston School District Police Department was traditionally arresting youth and responding to the behavior in that manner. And the My Brother's Keeper, My Brother and Sister's Keeper initiative saw the core principles of LEAD, and especially the component of having a case manager working with an individual in a very person-centered approach and not having an arrest happen, and said, what if we did this at a school level? And what if we had the principal, when a referral came in, instead of having the police make the arrest, talk with the police officers who were in the school and said, hey, let's refer this student to the social worker in the school, and use the school social worker as the case manager, and make it more of a restorative process as opposed to our normal street-based case manager, because they have the students right in the school. Not only not arrest the student, but not suspend the student, get the family in, and really start some more intensive case management with the student and the family right there with the school and the social worker and principal there. And they were able to do that, and they did that very successfully. They were actually able to stop having arrests happening at the school. They were able to stop, like in general, having charges filed for lower level crimes against kids in the school, and very successful.
Wow.
The pandemic changed a few things, and after the pandemic, they chose to not continue to lead. But it was based on, first of all, the pandemic, but second of all, the fact that when they looked at their statistics, they realized, hey, we solved our issue. We don't have any charges being filed. So it was a big success. So we always have in the back of our mind that LEAD, the core elements of LEAD, can work in the right circumstance, like it did there for youth. But we also always have in our mind what our core principles have been of the fact that we were built and we were made to address those folks that have been caught up in the system for a long time and those disparities. And we love the prevention work that they did, but we've always been kind of set down in this end. So, we have that kind of dichotomy of, which way to go. So we'd love to support. And that's kind of the role we play as the support bureau. We support folks that want to do initiatives and how we help them out to do that. So I think we'd love to support somebody else who is open to doing something like that. But that's kind of the story of the juvenile piece of LEAD.
So not your lane, but you'll support somebody in that lane. And I'm hopeful that there are some listeners who are thinking that is something that would be good in my district, and how do I get started? So we'll just leave that out there. When I sign off on my podcast, I always use a paraphrase of Dr. Angela Davis, who said, I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. So I always ask my guests, what is the thing you cannot accept? And what can my listeners do to support a change there?
So I think it goes back to what we started talking about. I can't accept that there's anyone that we can't sit down and have a conversation with and learn from each other and find a way to find some common ground where we can make this world better. And I think that's where we tend to fail, that we fail in the fact that, and I do this sometimes myself, that we see somebody, we hear from them, we think that what they have to say is going to go against us, or we just want to shut it off. And that's not, they're opposed to me, rather than like, hey, maybe I should actually talk to that person maybe I should try to learn from them. And it's something I learned in the police department, that like the folks, I would sometimes have people say to me, why are you talking to that person? And I'd say, because we can actually learn from them, because while they might be opposed to us, or you might think they're opposed to us, it's not that they're opposed to us. They just think we could do things better. And we can always do things better. We're human. We fail. We fail the majority of the time. We fail. So if we're not actually sitting down and talking, and we're not learning from other people, we're just going to continue to fail. Where we can actually win if we get together.
Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest today has been retired Chief Brendan Cox. We're going to put his contact information down in the notes. So if you'd like more information about LEAD or something else that he mentioned, make sure you contact him, Chief Cox. I want to thank you for joining me. It has been insightful. I have learned a lot. And Equity Warriors, if you want to change the impact of policing in your community, get involved. Stay involved. Vote. I say it every episode, vote like your life depended on it. Vote in those local elections, mayor, city council. Those are the people who hire your police chief, right? Vote in your school board elections, because those are the people who hire your superintendent. And if you're concerned about your school district police, they're the ones who hire that district police chief. Attend those local school board meetings, advocate through social media, follow me across all my channels, like, share, subscribe. And continue to join me every week. Connect with me. Use the links in the notes. Send your questions, topics, and requests to info@askdrbarry.com, and I will answer those questions and bring you experts to help address those topics. As always, don't worry about the things you cannot change. Let's get to work changing the things you can no longer accept. And I'll see you next time.
That's it for today's episode of the 3E Podcast. Head over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on iTunes will win a chance in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 value private VIP day with Dr. Barry herself. Be sure to head over to 3epodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Dr. Barry's gift. Then join us on the next episode.